Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Wednesday evening, joined by my friend and also expert scholar and contributor, Dr. Matthew Meinert. How are you, Dr. Meinert? Always good to have you on.
It's great to be here. Great to see you, Michael.
We're talking about your book here that you translated, The Sense of Mystery, subtitled Clarity and Obscurity in the Intellectual Life. And I'm going to put a link here soon in the description, but y'all can also go to Emmaus Academic and find it there. It is a book by Father Garrigou-Lagrange, but of course it is translated by Dr. Meinert. Dr. Meinert, let me ask you a couple questions. Well, you know what? Before I do that, I want to make sure that all of our viewers are aware. Towards the end, we're going to take of course, we're going to do our live chat questions, but I might take a couple live calls. The first live caller is going to get a prize today. They will get their very own Reason and Theology beer mug. So if you are the first caller, you will get one of these bad boys right here, free of charge. Email me your mailing address, wherever you want me to mail it to, and I'll send it to you. Again, I'll let y'all know when we're going to start taking calls. The number, just so if y'all want to write it down right now, it's 1-800-484-3801, 1-800-484-3801. I'll repeat it again towards the end when we start taking questions. And again, the first one to call will get their own beer mug. Maybe next time it'll be the coffee mug, but today we're going to do that one. Anyways,
I'm not having any beer. I'm just having water. But
yeah, well, I had some sweet tea in here, but it's all gone, so I don't think I'll be partaking in anything now. But anyways, yeah. So we're talking about the book that you translated by Father Garrigou-Lagrange, The Sense of Mystery. Now, let me ask you the first thing that I'm always curious anytime that somebody writes a book or translates it, of course, is what is it exactly about? Just a kind of,
high level
summary. Yeah.
In the 1930s, there were a couple essays that were percolating in the background of the Roman Thomist Garrigou-Lagrange, Father Garrigou-Lagrange, and we've talked about multiple times here. Right, I feel like I'm almost on that road show at times. I do other things, but Garrigou's work, I've spent a lot of time translating him. And I think that a theme started crystallizing in his head that he wanted to defend the idea that Thomism, and maybe even more broadly scholasticism, but really above all, Thomism in the Dominican school is not closed off to mystery, right? That scholasticism is not rationalism that kind of cuts out mystery from our experience, that conceptualizes the world according to its own categories, but doesn't have a sense for just how much of our knowledge actually is quite not deficient, maybe too strong of a word, but ultimately leaves a significant fringe of unspoken mystery, how hard it is to articulate even some of the most basic things. So we had some back and forth where I could feel that struggle, and had I known to prepare last time when we talked about the order of things, if I knew we were going to just talk about sensation, that's a great example though. The transition between not merely animals and humans, which is an infinite kind of transition between a material type of soul and the spiritual soul that we have, but even the transition between a crystal and a living being that just as a plant is already, just to articulate how substantiality is different between those two cases, is in a sense mysterious. Like, you will never really be able to fully grasp actually in a single concept that very notion, because it's analogical. The substance that is a crystal and the substance that is a plant are very different. And then life is very different between the plant and sense life, in such a way that to try to grasp the idea of life, we actually have to sort of understand all of those different types of life. And so there's so much mystery involved there. And then he keeps going into theological issues here too, right? How is Thomism sensitive to the mystery that remains in the revealed mysteries, right? Their supernaturality, the ultimate unspeakable eminence of the Godhead. So he writes an introduction that's less technical. The first half is kind of like less for experts, and then the second half has some more technical essays that are related to themes, that surround especially the theological issues. And he actually wrote the book the subtitle is Clarity and Obscurity in the Intellectual Life. That was me trying to convince Emmaus Academic to keep something from the original, because clair-obscur in French means chiaroscuro, which is that style of painting, like you think of Rembrandt, but any of these paintings where light is used for, 20, 25% of the painting to draw attention to certain things. Like, so here you've got this altar, with the light that's there surrounded by all the other darkness. It's that style of painting. And he on and off plays on that theme. Now, while we kept, of course, in the chapters that term, chiaroscuro, because you'd have to explain it. I mean, listen, even the translator, had to look it up the first time he looked it up. Because I'm just an Appalachian redneck in the end, despite the tie. But in the book, he talks about it, and it does come up. He has a whole chapter devoted to it at the end of the first section, for instance. So it's his attempt to talk about how Thomism is not insensitive, to the kind of philosophical mysteries, and then ultimately to the supernaturality and mysteries of the Godhead revealed in supernatural truths. Very powerful. Second half was very powerful for me, influencing, I think, the rest of my thought on the nature of theology, the nature of faith. There's some real excellent stuff there about the supernatural character of faith. Like, if you want to meditate in a more technical manner on that than just a devotional book, which can also be useful, it's like I would say read Sheban's Glories of Divine Faith, or whatever it is, and then read the second half of this book. The second half of this book has some real great stuff. But we'll talk about that sure soon. Now,
there were a lot of books that you could have translated, but you chose this one as your first translation. How come?
Yeah, I guess you're right, because I tend to think of it, because I've been so mired in all this Garrigou and Jean-Hervé Nicolas. The Jean-Hervé Nicolas stuff I did is going to be going on forever. It's like slowly being worked through by CUA. But, there are many other books out there too, right? I mean, I could have done, I could have done scholastic manuals. I could have done stuff by some of the Nouvelle Theologie folks that haven't been translated. I could have done old medieval texts that were closer to my dissertation. I was aware of Garrigou's work through Jacques Maritain, very influential in my licentiate. I've read the works of Maritain multiple times. Most of the whole collected works. They're very well-worn volumes on my shelves. His degrees of knowledge, which was deeply indebted on so many themes to Garrigou, probably set my intellectual path for everything I do. To be honest. And so I had engaged with some texts by Garrigou. I owned, because that was a period where you could buy them from ex fontibus. I owned most of the Garrigou texts by then. But I'd never deeply engaged with them. And as I shared a bit when we were talking about the order of things, I was, waiting for my dissertation director to answer emails. And so I was going through, and, I'll be honest, I just picked up the text and thought, I've heard of this guy. And it sounds more interesting than the realism of the principle of finality, right? Talk about a conquer of a title, even though I did translate it eventually. And yeah, the idea of, le sens du mystère. I was like, well, I'm bitter. I'm very bitter at people who say that, it's not always good reasons. Bitter at people who say that Thomism doesn't appreciate mystery. Bitter at a couple of my professors in graduate school who I thought downplayed and were too negative about Maritain and Garrigou. And in part, some of it is that they were rationalists, is how it was presented. There are other things too, and then just looking for something to do. And I just decided to start, and I liked the text so much. I was just like, well, I'm going to go ahead and keep doing this. And I didn't have a home for it or anything else, to be honest. I was, living on a grad student stipend, and I'd just gotten married actually. And so we were, in some ways I was living off my wife's largesse. I mean, I was teaching, but I was an adjunct at the time. And, I was doing this as a side project. And then it kind of it developed into all the other work I did. It's my first translation. There's part of me, of course, you'd like to go back and edit things, even mixed out a little bit. But it was somewhat just the labor of love, because of the love of the content itself. And it was my first foray with him, and I just, yeah, it's a really dear time when I think back to when I was working on the volume, actually.
You mentioned Maritain there. I told you, earlier today I read his book, short book, Liturgy and Contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
It was phenomenal. It was excellent. And it completely destroys the myth that these guys were just nothing but ivory tower scholars. It destroys the myth that that's what Western piety and spirituality really is anyway. It was incredible. I really, really enjoyed it.
That book is a marriage of what Maritain got from Garrigouvian spirituality with
Mhm.
some of the things going on with the liturgical movement.
Mhm.
But yeah, all the stuff on contemplation, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, everything you feel that's related to that's all Garrigou stuff that was deeply graved into his soul in the 20s. Yeah.
He was citing Garrigou a lot, St. John of the Cross, St.
Mhm.
Teresa of Avila. He even started talking about some of the Eastern saints, Maximus the Confessor, and some others that find their way into the Philokalia. And then, he was engaging, the best of the best in East and West, and it will completely destroy any kind of myth that the West is nothing but heady and intellectual only, and as opposed to the East, which is more spiritual and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure, of course, others, they're developing this stuff out of their tradition, but Garrigou always made the point when he talked about, for instance, the mysteries of faith, and it's very much discussed in the second half of this book, the essential supernaturality of the revealed mysteries, because in the language of the East, they're uncreated character. Just it's trying to make the
Mhm.
same point in this regard.
Mhm.
The uncreated character of the revealed mysteries in itself requires the apophaticism of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, precisely because it so outstrips the conceptual tools that faith could ever use to super elevate, to make statements of faith, right?
Mhm.
That our knowledge through faith has this internal dynamic that moves us toward really the need for mystical experience. This is why, he's credited, and, sometimes these narratives are simplified, but they credit his influence on people like John Paul II with being behind
Yeah.
universal call to holiness.
Mhm.
Well, there's more to that history in Gaudium et Spes, no doubt. Nonetheless, it actually has built into it, a complete bashing of the idea that you've got any kind of ultimate separation of holiness within the church, right? He warred against that all of his life. No, 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 no. Faith makes calls all of us to be mystics of the sort.
And he explicitly notes that in this text. He explicitly argues for that. Yeah. But yeah, I liked that he was also citing Garrigou, and in a way that you just don't expect. You just think somebody like Garrigou is going to be all intellect, no spirituality, and no, he's pointing to different things that Garrigou said that were very insightful and contemplative. So I really appreciated it.
That's a funny dynamic too, because sometimes people are almost conflicted. Like on occasion, Louis Bouillet, I'm sure you know the work of Bouillet, he'll talk about this or that in Garrigou's non-spiritual theology, and you feel the wanting to critique of Garrigou of being a rationalist.
Mhm.
Yet Bouillet, when he does write about the spiritual theology of Garrigou, he's actually quite positive, because you just can't deny in the end. And I think that it's important to see how that's not just in his spiritual theology; it's in his philosophy and in his general theology as well.
Mhm.
Like he can take something as difficult as the unicity of God
Mhm.
and the eminence of the deity and turn it into a mystical reflection on God's transcendence.
Mhm.
And it's at once highly technical, and yet also it shows that even technical theology ought to have a contemplative bent to it. It's great. So anyway, sorry, just we're more like we're riffing back and forth, but that's always a little bit better than like
Well,
Dr.
no,
Leonard's Roadshow.
and I think that that's an excellent approach that they take. I mean, it seems like they're providing the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he loves doing it. I experienced it here and now. I can't unsee it. He loves to step back and take a synthetic look at things. There's a wonderful quote. Father Cajetan Cuddy has a really great introduction in this volume that he wrote for the volume. I think very highly of Father Cajetan, where he cites Garrigou's own words. Whenever he was a young man, he said he remembered that he was getting caught up in all the scholastic quibbling and all the scholastic disputations, right? All the different conclusions that you have to hold as a Thomist. And he had an experience that led him, to realize that you must meditate on the principles of your theology, which will be, the revealed truths, and to penetrate and savor the light that you get from those loftiest truths that God has spoken to us. And the same thing goes actually for your, for the first truths of philosophy as well, right? The first truths of philosophy are the light of all philosophy. And I thought it was in a paragraph, like broken out in a paragraph, but it's not. There it is, because he's referring to Our Lady. So it's actually in his text on the priest in union with Christ. He says, as a young student, I was so engrossed in the many and varied questions of critique, it says critica, but epistemology and metaphysics, that I was in danger of losing my simplicity and elevation of mind and balanced judgment. It was then that I realized I needed a spiritual mother with unlimited kindness and wisdom. It'd be interesting to see the whole text too, where he talks about that.
Now, talking here about mystery,
yep,
especially in the West, he engages St. Thomas Aquinas in his sense of mystery. Can you tell us a little bit about it? What was, according to Garrigou, Thomas's sense of mystery?
Well, there's the famous story about Aquinas when he's a young man, right, at Monte Cassino. What is the question he asks, Michael? Keeps asking.
Well, I remember is this whenever he poked the prostitute out of his room?
Oh, no.
Okay, never mind.
I think it's who is God. I don't think it would be what is God. But it's always on his lips. Question: who is God? Who is God? Who is God?
Yeah.
So one of the themes, there's discussion of how St. Thomas has a philosophical sense of mystery, and I sometimes think some of that is, Father Garrigou-Lagrange is emphasizing what has to be there in Aquinas, but through Father Garrigou's own subjective experience. Mm-hmm. But it's very clear that at the heart of Thomistic theology is the mystery of the Godhead, unknowable in himself except through divine revelation, supereminent beyond any concept, beyond being truth, oneness, etc. Technically, even though he contains all of those perfections. That the awareness of the centrality of that mystery that radiates through the rest of theology bears witness, especially in the theological order, to St. Thomas's lofty conception of faith, which then spills over into his appreciation in each of the various mysteries. So that's how he presents it. Now, truth be told, it's easy to get lost in the text of Aquinas and lose that sense of mystery. Distinguish this and distinguish that. But above all, this text, above all, the supernaturality of faith, as articulated and as clearly experienced by Aquinas, is the central, real motif of this book, I would say. Whatever might be said about philosophical knowledge and philosophical sense of mystery, as important as that is, that's really what's dear to the heart of Garrigou in this text, which is very important. There were battles in 19th and 20th century scholasticism over the resolution of faith that actually reduced the assent of faith to a kind of discursive knowledge that got backed onto the judgment of credibility. It would actually resolve faith ultimately somewhat into its judgment of rational credibility, which would seem to the Thomist eye to lower faith down to the level of reason, right? You need to actually see that the illumination that comes through supernatural faith really is a new eye, a new birth, so.
Yeah, but I mean, that being said, I mean, isn't it the case that something that is true about God can't be irrational? It might be above a reason, but
that's different. That's very different than saying it's resolved into that judgment.
Right. Okay, I got
you. The sort of standard way of talking about it is we believe precisely because God has supernaturally revealed, by which we mean through the mediacy of the church who proposes, or at least by rights through the church. In the case of implicit faith, that becomes more difficult. But through the mediacy of the church, who is the objective component of proposing the truth. We believe the God who has now spoken in the depths of our heart through whatever mediacy there, a given truth. So it's God's infinite, supernatural, paternal, loving, revealing self is the motive of our faith, which is very different than it's incredibly reasonable to believe this because of the arguments of like the doctrine is really good, right? It's the most rational doctrine. It's accompanied with certain miracles. There's the miraculous history of the church. All of that is in the end of a level infinitely below the ascent of faith. And this is thematic in the book. Or I wouldn't be drilling into it. These latter chapters, he takes this up over and over again. And I think that seems to be central for him for thinking through the real importance of the supernatural sense of mystery that St. Thomas has.
No,
but also, I want to be clear that when Thomists talk about things like moral knowledge or about like the certitude that you have through prudence, or about what we talked about earlier, different degrees of knowledge, different degrees of life, the whole philosophy of the analogy of being, that all bears witness to a willingness to accept mystery where it's at. To say that being is said in many different ways, depending on what it is predicated of, that cuts away a kind of clear and distinct set of concepts that you can form. If you want to think, just for instance, being is said of you and I, of the angels. We're all, finite independent substances. But we also say being, this book has a being. Now, this is me developing stuff a little bit. I've talked about this before. But the unity of this book is an artifact. But we can use being in both of those senses. And we're legitimately using being. And either you could go look for a single concept for being to unite those, or you can have a robust theory of analogy. But when you have a robust theory of analogy, you realize how mysterious the notion of being is. And you soon will wander around through the forests of Bavaria, looking for enlightenment, for the opening of the light, like Heidegger, transfixed by being. So anyway, not to be too pro-Heideggerian, right? I don't want to get all of a sudden people will be saying he used to be a trad and he likes that Nazi philosopher. It's like, no, I'm just trying to use the image of poor old Marty wandering through the woods. So
now, one thing I was trying to read through the part where he was talking about the Sphinx, and I wasn't really following it. If you could maybe explain that part, because that really caught my eye.
The riddle of the Sphinx. Well, hold on. That's and it's been I apologize. It's been a while since I looked directly at it. Let me pull up. That guy. That's from Ernest Hello. If you're looking it up, but there was an author who was really important for Garrigou's intellectual translation. Ernest Hello was his name. His book,
page 271.
He cites him over and over and over again. That's very important for him. I just wish this is, you can see I was not actually given, this is no blame to Michael, actually. This is not one of these pre-prepared interviews where you know that you're looking at a quote. This is a great thing. Maybe your viewers, we could just go through it and I'll comment because it captures so much. He's coming to the end of, he's talking about predestination. I would like to avoid delving into the problems of the Thomistic theories of predestination because that's just going to get us in a rat hole about the Benyazianism and everything else. But actually, it's quite interesting because he reduces in the end the whole question of predestination to just to its most basic principles. Like he actually in this text does not get involved in all of the debates of the later school. Bernard Lonergan makes fun of him for this and says, I wish that I had discovered the Chiaroscuro that Father Garrigou-Lagrange found to get out of this. But he says, basically the two principles that command the whole debate are God never commands something that's impossible, but makes it really possible for every adult to accomplish his or her duty. And also, too, that no one would be better than another, or really technically nothing would be better than another if it or he or she were not loved more by God. And that these two principles command, like these are the two main principles that end up commanding the rest of the discussion of predestination. And there's a temptation to try to find all the answers and to try and make this utterly clear. And he drives home the fact that, you know, if you want to solve the problem of predestination, literally you're trying to combine together the divine freedom and, you know, divine justice and divine mercy all together. And, you know, the only place those are all combined together is in the eminence of God himself. Right? That is the only place. And there's I guess to me, you know, especially since I'm not an expert in those matters, I tend to leave it there. I just, you know, it's like that quote from Augustine, which I think he quotes too, where he says, you know, if you're going to ask about why one thief was taken and the other not, you know, stop asking that question, like how dangerous it is. I think there's great wisdom in that. But so he tells, he pulls this text from Ernst Hello, which, if I remember correctly, actually, the guys over at CatholicCulture.org really liked. Thomas Miras. And I think he closed the podcast we did a couple years ago by reading this passage. So, you know, he proposes what it's like to accept mystery whenever the Sphinx gives his riddle. So why don't I just go ahead and take that guy? I'll give you Reminder's dramatic representation. So he says, among the secrets that antiquity reveals to us, Joseph de Maistre, the political philosopher, could have counted the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a monster who proposes the riddle or the enigma of destiny. And we must divine the riddle or be devoured by the monster. What could be more preposterous? However, what could be more profound if men knew how to actually read reality? To divine. In human language, this word has a truly singular and unique status. You see, I'm reading it when I'm updating the translation, because it's like, this is what I would do now. For the thing that it expresses, the reality that's expressed by the word to divine, does not seem to be at man's disposal, right? We use the word to divine the future, but of course it already indicates that we're looking for something beyond ourselves, right? Because it's to divine, to have the kind of knowledge that God would have. And yet, we want it. For man, it is a matter of importance, one that makes him tremble. In order to accomplish this kind of divinization, there's no foreknown process, right? It's this kind of inspiration. And yet no one can express the regret to which he who does not accomplish it is exposed. Life combines together persons and things, the good, the bad, the mediocre, the very good, the very bad, the sublime, and the hideous. You know, all within our experience, the people we know, the experiences we have. And all of these jostle about among each other on the roads of life. And we seem to just pass by the different people who fit these descriptions by chance, he says. And, you know, the normal human approach is to live at the level of appearances, right? To just sort of note these things and go along and miss the profound mystery that's going on. Reminds me of, you know, I don't know if I ever shared this on here or not. I think I did. I would have had to have when I talked about the angels in the Summa lectures. When I was a monk, I had this experience where I was really hating my confreres, who I just took for granted normally. But I was very angry because it was horrible at choir, how poorly they were chanting. And I looked across them, and I started off, to be honest, thinking about how miserable I thought and lazy I thought certain people were. And all of a sudden, I just lit where I saw beyond the appearances. Like, they're unique. It was like seeing each of them in their divine ideas. It was a profound experience. But how often do you know? I just stayed on. Yeah, there's Father Aaron doing his thing. There's Father so and so. There's Father so and so. You know, so like you just miss the mystery of persons, of providence going on around you, because it's providence is what's really in the background here. A multitude of veils. You know, we veil over our experience day to day by many different kinds of devices that keep us from appreciating the mystery that's before our eyes. Timidity, dissimulation, ignorance. I'm kind of going back and forth between Hello and my commentary at this point. And all of these different veils that we put over reality hide the profound reality behind us. Men do not speak their secrets. They keep their uniform. They keep dressed in their given status. The man who would see from his window a very populous road would be terrified if he were to reflect on the magnificent or awful realities that pass before him without speaking his name. I mean, think about every person you meet as being solicited by the gifts of grace at every minute. Think about that terrible reality, and there's the whole drama of sin and redemption going on in every single person.
Mm.
But it's so disguised and covered. Yet the dread of this unspeaking, intelligent spectator of the crowd would grow. You'd even feel more dread if you were to say to yourself, "My life perhaps depends, above all, my supernatural life, above all, my supernatural life, perhaps depends on one of these men or women who passes by my window under your very eyes." And the great drama captures this, right? And great religious drama can really capture this. The way that the mystery of the very communication of life of grace would depend on someone who providentially was put in your path. Like, I mean, really, it's so easy to float along and miss this. All of us, it's so easy. You know, you're a family man. I'm a family man. You know, you're just trying to, get by and occasionally have a bit of relaxation, be it, going outdoor and skiing or thinking that, basketball in 50-degree weather is cold, whichever you do. Based on a private conversation, I was making fun of the Southerner who thinks 55 is cold. Right. But you're trying to go by on the day-to-day stuff. And like the whole mystery of the human experience and the divine life is going on right here. So everything warns the man who may need to divine. Like there are warnings there, right? In reality impinges itself. You really should have an eye to see this, but there's no rule for actually defining these things well. To actually have the eye of faith to see what's before you here. He says, "Whence the Sphinx?" So the spectacle of things that must be divined, and that we can't actually divine, led the ancients down one pathway, and it's an abyss that it led ancient philosophy down, and it drew its prey. And there's a truth here, even if it's stylized, it captures most of the classical ancients in some way or another, namely fatalism of some sort. There's even a fatalism of sorts, I think, in Aristotle, but it's much worse in like atomism, in a way, Stoicism, right? Mm-hmm. The eternal return is, just drawn in its consequences by Nietzsche, but there's a fatalism in the cyclical world of the Greeks, or especially in the world of the pure materialist, for whom the world is just the dropping of atoms, right, that happen to swerve, and that's all the more that freedom is. And so on the edge of this fatalism, leaning over the chasm, the Sphinx stands with an attitude that is at once mysterious and terrible. If fatalism were true, if the idea that there is, like, freedom is not there, the mystery of freedom, the mystery of grace as well, we would say, is not there, all questions would be insoluble, and the only appropriate response is despair. It's eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow you die. That's ultimately a despair, right? If in the end everything is just necessary, the soul should be bored with a kind of bored down deep. I mean, not bored like tired, but there should be a hole deep down in you of despair. Nietzsche tries to say that there should be a kind of joyful, like, willing of this, right? That you should will strongly, right now, everything you do, because, you're going to will it for eternity as everything returns, everything repeats. I mean, that's, to my eyes, it's the last ditch effort to try to not despair is what that is, right? Because in the end, it's all preset. It's all meaningless. It's all meaningless because there's no freedom. There's no choice that's going on here. It's just the playing out of, it's meaningful just in the sense that it's playing out of what's already foreordained. But he says, in general, the questions that seem to call for a despairing response are poorly posed. That you've set them up wrongly. You backed yourself into a philosophical corner that gets you, focused on this fatalism of determinism. And the despairing responses are often as superficial as they seem, even as they seem profound. They seem to be profound with a kind of worldly wisdom. You can marshal all the reasons of physio-mathematical science to convince yourself of the non-existence of freedom, but in the end, you're not even taking the fundamental data correctly. So now, of course, this is not a philosopher who's writing. Hello. So let's keep going. Through all time, there is an unknown that must be brought to light, an X, a great X, that defies the sources of algebra. The ancient Sphinx wished that there would be no response. There's no response to this. There is a response, however, to the Sphinx's question, and we can slay him. So how are we to divine? How are we to divine? A poor man approaches and asks for hospitality. Perhaps he is an angel of the Lord, but perhaps he's an assassin. Therefore, how are we to divine? Must we make an effort of thought, an astonishing act of intelligence? Get ready, because Garrigou-Lagrange is citing this as very important. No. We see the secret. To divine is to love. He who loves, he who has the high. Sorry, this is Garrigou's quote. He sticks this in. So this is such funny. Like I could feel it almost immediately as I was looking ahead at the text. I was like, oh, that sounds like Garrigou. I was like, oh yeah, that's one of his parentheses he added. So Ernst Hello rhetorically says, the way that you're going to have the eye to see here, like interacting subject to subject, person to person, in this case, right? Assassin or an angel of the Lord, is to be moved really ultimately the gifts of the Holy Spirit as well as the virtues. So he says to divine is to have the eye of love. Then Garrigou puts in parentheses, he who loves, he who has the highest of the virtues, charity, love of God and neighbor, this man also has the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of wisdom, knowledge, understanding, counsel, which, despite the obscurity of faith, allow him to penetrate and taste that which he must grasp in the mystery of things and in the mystery of God. So it's a way of saying, like, right there, he sees in Hello's thing the role of the gifts of the Holy Spirit throughout our life, like not just in mystical experience, even because counsel is going to be in our quotidian decisions. For Christ, you can't begin to imagine how in the human nature of Christ, the Holy Spirit was operative through counsel for everything that he did. That's how the Thomists are going to approach the whole gnomic will kind of thing that you have in the East, is thinking about how Christ's human nature was docile, or Christ as man is really the way probably best to put it, was docile to the Holy Spirit. Left to itself, the intellect, this Garrigou. This was why when I got to this, I was like, this book has to get published. Because great quote. I'm so glad you brought this up. Everyone who presents Garrigou, they're like, he's an intellectualist. He's all into the intellect. He's cold and rational. That's what Thomists are about. They often sound like that. But here is the man who's presented as the great, cold intellect of the Nouvelle Theologie crisis, who writes, or cites at least here and agrees with it. Left to itself, the intellect embarks upon an ocean of thoughts. The problem of life stands before it. And if the compass's needle has lost its knowledge for finding true north, if the compass is distracted, the intellect can very easily arrive in practice in doubt, in theory at fatalism. It's actually tragic when you read this that he so misunderstood Maurice Blondel, but that's a totally different thing. But that's like one of these pins that I put for my own mind. The ancient Sphinx. It is the impotent intellect arriving at despair and rushing toward its death. Love knows better its path. In practice, it arrives at the light. In theory, at justice. This recompense conferred upon him who divines, refused to him who does not divine. This is the recompense of this experience of reality through love, contains a supreme justice, a justice that is superior to the justice that speaks its rules. The way that he's thinking here, the way the virtues give us a tact for actually knowing what we should do, sometimes in a way that's actually hard to explain, that this is the right choice. But it's not a relativism. But boy, could you imagine a Thomist saying this? Mm. It is the secret that was ultimately corrupted or altered by the myth of the Sphinx. He who divines is repaid, for he who divines is he who loves. He who does not divine is not repaid, for he who does not divine is he who does not love. He who loves grandeur, the person who seeks true grandeur. He who loves grandeur and he who loves the forsaken will recognize grandeur if grandeur is there. It's a great text. He quotes below over and over again throughout this book. Yeah.
Yeah, and I appreciate you explaining it because at first I didn't get it, but I was reading through it a little quickly, so I appreciate you giving commentary on it. Makes a little more sense
Yeah.
now.
Well, yeah, and on top of it, it's you know, it's a rhetorical text, rhetorical French. And as I was reading it, I mean, on occasion, I was like, "Oof, that's correct." Like I see it, I'm like, I know what that says in French, but I'm like, I've learned to smooth over the French a little bit
Right.
more. But I'm reading something by someone who's it's their first lengthy French translation. I see some of the same stuff, and I'm like, it's a hard business. It's a hard business. I'm very merciful to translators, so.
Now, he also talks about the relationship between nature and grace here. And can you maybe give us just a quick overview on what all he touches on here? What is the relationship between nature and grace?
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing that he wants to deal with is there are maybe two or three things, but one that it's an interesting essay in here. He wants to talk about how our like the highest point of our knowledge before the knowledge of the possibility of the vision of God, and so he has actually a lengthy discussion of how the highest thing we can actually prove, you could say, it's not merely talking about God's existence by our natural knowledge, but there is a supernatural order of truths. By reason alone, we can prove, based on our knowledge of God's existence and of, we could say his attributes, the names that we use for him, we can say that in God himself is the supreme mystery, which is only known to him. So it's a very negative knowledge. It's relative and negative because it's not what we're actually even knowing about him. It's the knowledge he has of himself. And it would not be unbefitting for him to reveal it, but that's all the further you can go. Because you can't even step one step further and say, because then he has a second chapter on this, to say it would be possible for him to reveal that. Because as soon as you say that, you're actually implicitly talking about the nature of grace, the very possibility of the beatific vision. So he has a discussion, can we demonstrate the possibility of the beatific vision? That's another way of saying, can we demonstrate the possibility of God revealing himself to a finite creature in full glory? Well, to do that, it's going to presuppose everything downstream that's related to that, at least up to the light of glory, but arguably all the way down through sanctifying grace. And so, by reason alone, you can only negatively say it would not be unbefitting that God do that, but I don't know how he would. It's sort of like the highest proof of that. More than likely never done by philosophy, right? That's the kind of thing that's proven by theology and apologetics. So it's theology using reason just for reason alone, but it's being guided by theology's knowledge of our ultimate end. You prove the eminent fittingness, but negatively, of that possible natural revelation. And then he reflects a bit too on the eminence of the deity. That chapter 3 is why my poor daughter's middle name is named after Cadgen. This is a beautiful chapter. So her middle name is Guetin because of that chapter. That just I think that's just profound. And then, so after having dealt with that, we could call it the border of faith or nature and grace, because you're dealing with the fundamental orientation of the intellect as natural versus as divinized through grace. Here's a very important chapter on the difference between the supernaturality of grace and miracles. It's easy to see once you see it. You say something like, for instance, when Christ healed, a man born blind, he restored in a supernatural manner something that was natural sight, which is very different than supernaturally giving us a supernatural life.
Right.
So, but very often the notion of supernaturality is not parsed carefully enough. And in this chapter, he parses out all the various different senses of supernaturality. Friend of mine who just, I had forgotten to send him a book and he had asked me for it. And he and I were talking recently. He thinks he really liked that chapter. He thought that was actually not a very good chapter. And then there's a good chapter on then the supernaturality of faith after that. And if you've never learned about like the nominalist errors about faith, it's a good primer, an introduction to that, right? It's not going to get into all of the history, but it flexes your muscles to see how some people really thought about faith in a way that was ultimately reducing it to the level of reason. And so understand that error, you understand then what I think is a much saner and sounder understanding of the nature of faith. These are all really important chapters. Like just looking at these again, I can see in these chapters so much of my future thought and writing. Because it's like these gave me lights that were very important for me intellectually and in my spiritual life too.
So it's a good primer and foundation.
Yeah, it is. And it breathes because he's trying to write it in a way that shows that Thomism has a sense of mystery. So just as he gets technical, he does pull back because he's really trying to communicate, I think, some of the swath of what it implies for us, like the experience that it's giving witness to.
Now, towards the end, I don't know what this is, which is why I want to ask about it. What is the spiritual Chiaroscuro? I don't even know how to pronounce that.
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I did an interview, I had to look it up, right?
Yeah.
Because Chiaroscuro is this painting, right? It's this style of painting, the darkness and the light. So just historically, in the world of, art history, that style of painting. And that's what he's doing throughout here, is trying to play off the idea that while Thomism has these light of principles, they actually are revealing to us in what we know something that's quite dark. You're walking into the divine darkness that ultimately is more than what you can actually articulate. And this is like a 10-page summarization of how he digested St. John of the Cross is what this is. Because he's outlining how the purification through the night of the senses and the night of the spirit are necessary for purifying our faith. That the light of faith needs to go through these darknesses. So if you're in French, you can hear resonances, if you were a French speaker, of clair and obscur, of light-filled and dark-filled, or darkness. And those two words together, just clair and obscur, that's actually just how you do chiaroscuro in French. The word just means light darkness, effectively. So that style of painting. And so he's talking about how in the life of faith, there is at once, the great light that is the light of God. We use this in our language, right? Illumination, the light of faith. And yet it has ultimately, in its highest manifestation here below, it's expressed in the gift of wisdom, by which we have a kind of the Thomists talk about quasi-experiential, because they're trying to get as immediate as possible. And the language is not just thrown around. There's a real technical set of discussions that goes on in other texts about that. So he's not just making words up. But it's quasi-experiential knowledge of God active in our soul, but we know him through love that actually transforms our ascent of faith. So love becomes the means of knowledge and contemplation. It's incredibly apophatic, but you have to go through the kind of purification that John of the Cross talked about. Of course, the language stays in a kind of monastic vocabulary. You and I, as laymen, know that these take different forms in our life, right? To have the experience of the purification of faith, right? That God works through other, multiple means, not just the means that would have been applicable to, Carmelites in a certain era. But the general idea of the purification of senses, the purification of the spirit remains universally applicable. And it's about that dynamic of the light of faith calling, however, for the darkness and mystery of knowledge of God through love, through the gift of the Spirit. Not even us willing that love through charity, right? But the Spirit blowing where he will. So it's a great 10 pages, just a little 10 pages that this summarizes all the rest of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like the analogy using this artwork. And I was going to say, I love this painting that's used here. I think the book says this was the Cathedral of Pisa, the interior of the Cathedral of Pisa.
Okay, yeah, it's just been a while since I looked at the.
I love it. I didn't know there was a whole style of these paintings.
Yeah, when they came to me, I said to them, I insisted, because I was like, I know you guys are going to get rid of chiaroscuro, and that's okay. You don't sell many academic books, but I'm going to sell way less if I use that. But I said, Colin, make sure you reflect it in the artwork. And I had no say. They came to me with this, though. I was like, this is great. I said, that's it. At least for order of things, I kind of helped with that. They gave me some options. I thought this was great. It's great because the light draws your attention to certain things. But like, when you're looking at the cover, the priest at the altar there, comes to light. But then right beyond the altar, the cross behind the altar, the baldacchino that's probably there, all that in the darkness, which captures something too about the mystery of what's going on in the holy sacrifice. Yeah. Now I have a very special place in my heart also for like Dutch masters. So like Rembrandt's use of chiaroscuro, I like, but don't question me too much because I am a redneck in the hills despite the bow tie. So
well, one of my favorite paintings of Saint Jerome evidently is a chiaroscuro. At least they're using that technique.
I think I know. It's a great image actually.
It's actually this one. I'll pull it up right here. You should be able to see that.
Yeah, but you see there, there are different percentages. This, and I learned this, Garrigou mentions it in the book, so I hope he's correct. There are different percentages of light and dark that people use. But there's that famous Caravaggio, I think, of the conversion of St. Paul is like this, or St. Matthew. If you looked up Caravaggio, St. Matthew, maybe you'll be able to pull that up. That's another good example. Yeah, can you pull that up, the Calling of St. Matthew?
There it is. Yeah. Let me
save it. The percentage of light and darkness are different, but
yeah, let me save it and pull it on the screen here. Y'all should be able to see it now.
Right, but it's the same use of. I mean, one of the techniques that are clearly being used is that play of light and darkness.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. Yeah, I like that. Now everybody has been chomping at the bit for for the beer mug. So let me again put it on the screen. It's gonna be this one right here. You'll get your own Reason in Theology beer mug if you are the first to call to ask your question for Dr. Meinert. I'll go ahead and give the number out. It's 1-800-484-3801. 1-800-484-3801. Gotta type it fast. Let me put it in the chat. 38.
I was thinking, it's just going to be one of these guys in the chat are going to be,
everybody's been asking about it. So. But I thought maybe I'll do this one or the coffee mug, but I chose this one today. Maybe another time we'll do the coffee mug or the shirt, or there's another one where you have the handle for the beer mug. I don't know what that one's called.
Like a Stein, beer Stein.
Right? Yeah, you have that one. Yeah. We got one of those with the R&T logo on it. This one is the regular cup, 16 ounce. So, yeah. 1-800-484-3801. I'm surprised we haven't got a call yet. Well, and also go ahead and put in your questions there in the chat. Make sure to put it to @Reason in Theology so I can pick them out from comments and I can ask those as well. Let's see, because I think I saw a few earlier. Let me go to them. One second, I'm trying to find it.
Filters through. It's always active. I keep it off because it distracts me. I just keep the private chat.
Yeah, and it moves around on me as well. So I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, Mike, I see someone because I'm pulling up here. Mike says he's going to put some Bud Light in that bad boy. Well, I mean, whether or not you want to use Bud Light in it, I'll leave you do that. But like, you calling, Mike?
you can put in whatever you want.
It says it's not. It says not calling though. Someone said, or I don't know if it says not calling through. So just keep an eye and say.
Huh. Well, very, very odd. And let me double check. I mean, yeah, there it is. Okay, here we go. Hello, caller. This is Reason in Theology. You're live. What is your name and your question? And by the way, you're the first caller. So after the call, just email me at reasonandtheology@gmail.com with your mailing address, and I'll send you the beer mug. But yeah, what's your name?
Michael, this is Elijah. I'm not trying to win the beer. I'm just trying to see if it was working, the number. So
Okay. Well,
I was
hey,
just testing it.
well, you get one anyway, just because you're, Elijah. So of course you're
Right.
gonna get one. But all right, next caller still gets one anyway. But yeah, it's coming through. I don't know what was going on. Maybe everyone was calling all at the same time. But even still, normally when
Probably.
that's the case, we normally get calls. So I don't know, but
Sure,
you'll get one anyway, though.
All right. Hey, God bless you guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, bless you, Elijah.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know. 1-800-484-3801.
And also, make
1-800.
clear, just because a couple people did ask again, their chat is also fine. So I just see
Yeah.
some questions that said, can we get questions through chat?
Yeah, here's a question. Thanks, Dr. Monder. I just brought the book and hopefully it arrives soon. I wonder if Garrigou talks about the epistemic status of belief, evidentialism versus reform epistemology. Do you have any comments there?
So it's going to be really different than the language that one would find in analytic views. Some of that's going to get treated. You're going to basically, here's how I would approach it. You're going to get the high level principles that are needed for just talking about the ascent of faith versus the ascent of reason in this text. Some of the themes, but in much more spread out form, are going to be in De Revelatione, and then somewhat in the faith volume as well. So I'm not trying to come here and just hawk my books, but we were putting together the schedule. De Revelatione should be out like Christmas time of this year. It's huge. It's like 500,000 words. So the editing's taking us a long time. But in that volume, because he does so much about the various distinctions, kinds of judgments that are involved with the ascent of faith, and to the degree in which you have to have a supernatural motion that's involved with the pious affect of faith even. So you're picking up on all these themes from like the Council of Orange onward, or the Synod of Orange onward. That stuff's in De Revelatione everywhere, in every chapter spread out. So I would just say, if you're looking to try and get like a reading program, read this volume, see if you can find that Theological Virtues of Faith volume. So you'll get some answers there. And then the big two volumes on Revelation would be your best go-to. But that's going to still be the end of the year. So
there was another question that I had, and I know that it wasn't something that you really wanted to dive a whole lot into, and that's okay if you want to maybe just briefly talk about it. But well, you know what? Let me hold off on that one. It was going to be about divine predilection and the possibility of salvation for all, which does get into the predestination. But let me table that one. He talks a little bit about the deity and the divine attributes. He has a little section on that. Can you maybe comment on it and tell us, does he really get into the essence and energies kind of problem?
it's close to it, right? Because remember, the Thomists take a position that is incredibly high on the divine simplicity register. There are no distinctions between the various divine names. So what one will find in Basil's famous letter about the energies being applied to the different divine names, no distinction in the divine names whatsoever. They're only in the end conceptual. They're what the Thomists call a minor virtual distinction. That basically our mind, based on the analogies, so we're just talking philosophically right now, not in terms of what's revealed, but our mind, by the analogies we can form about knowledge, love, truth, beauty, mercy, justice, provident, actually, all of these can be applied to God. But in the end, all those distinctions of terms are on our side, and you actually can show this is, I'm developing a bit out of his book, God, and his essence and his nature, or his existence in nature. We talk about how each of those perfections have within them the need to be completed by the others. So being actually calls out to be completed by truth. Truth actually calls out to be completed by knowledge, ever actual knowledge. So there's an internal dynamic by which all of those notions actually call for being combined in the eminence of the deity. But we only achieve that through the knowledge of the various attributes. And so the Thomist always has to fight against being called a nominalist. And that's normal for Orthodox to say that this is a kind of nominalist position, or at least it's one of the kind of normal positions. But definitely there's no distinction. So even though they don't talk about essence and energies, the fight against Scotus is here, because Scotus has a formal distinction between those attributes. And he lays out Cajetan's rebuttal of that. There's a beautiful passage in there from Cajetan where Cajetan sounds like Pseudo-Dionysius, and he talks about how God is above being, above unity, above goodness. It's amazing to see, because Cajetan tends to be thought of as being hyper-Aristotelian. And it's a beautiful passage that later Thomists who got embarrassed of Garrigou because of the Nouvelle Theologie crisis, and they kind of wanted to stay cool, they still cite this passage out of Cajetan. And it just makes me think that he must have made that very central in his teaching at the Angelicum. So,
Caller, you're live with Reason and Theology. What's your name?
Hey, how you doing? My name's Justin.
Hey, how are you?
hello, Justin.
I'm doing very well.
And you're the first caller, so you'll get the free beer cup. Now, if you want, just email me at reasonandtheology@gmail.com with your mailing address after the show, and I'll mail it out to you.
Very, very much thanks. I appreciate it. But I'm actually more interested in the answers of Dr. Monitor to my questions.
Yeah, what's your question?
Dr. Monitor, could you articulate the Bergsonian idea of becoming, maybe its origins in Heraclitus, and then also how that is distinct from the Aristotelian Thomistic view of being, and how that was kind of a battle that Father Lagrange was trying to wage in that book that he wrote, God, His existence, and His nature.
Sure, and it's also in the order of things, and I think we can tie it in pretty well here too. So yeah, it's a great question, Justin. I think I can catch everyone there, both the Garrigou question, kind of with that, and then tie it into this. So very good. So is that anything else you want to add, or I can go ahead and? You still there?
He should be.
Yeah. Still here. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, good. Yep, I'll go ahead and start answering. So Justin was referring to Henri Bergson, who is one of the great foes of Father Garrigou. He was a French philosopher. Probably mentioned him in some past talk. It's like you can't swing a cat through Garrigou's works without hitting Bergson. And I wish this was the only volume that doesn't have an index. I can't imagine that Bergson doesn't come up here as well. Bergson was known for his work on it's called creative evolution, and it's basically a kind of reiteration of an evolutionary version of Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the ancient philosopher who most famously people say, they cite this one text out of him, although there's more to his fragments. He's very mysterious, but he's received by Aristotle above all as saying, you can't step into the same river twice. All of reality is like fire in the end. The basic stuff of reality is change. And your eyes, your experience of life bears witness to this, right? You can't but go around the world and see change. And so the fundamental reality is change. And Aristotle ends up articulating part of his philosophical answers about causality and about reality in contradiction to, or in opposition to, Heraclitus, as well as the followers of Parmenides, who takes the opposite side. There is no change. Being is and non-being is not. We talked about this a little bit last time. So for Heraclitus, becoming, change, we could say, you can do this with you can draw lots of freshmen and sophomores in college to listen to you. Dynamism, right? Striving. These are the things that make up reality. And Bergson plugged that sort of outlook, which ties into ancient atomism and other things as well, interestingly enough. Of course, Parmenides ties into that too, but sorry. He took that kind of philosophy of becoming, change, alteration, that's the fundamental structure of things, and he combined it with the evolutionary theory of the late 19th century, early 20th century. That all of reality is just a process of becoming. I mean, in a sense, reality it's like Hegel, but it was, I don't want to say dumbed down, because it's not as though Bergson was dumb, but it was popularized. And it's like a kind of evolutionary popularized version of Hegel, that you've got God realizing himself through the evolution of the world, which is the like fundamental reality, is this thrust upward. And, you know, as the urge of becoming goes upward, change, that's all things are, change. You have species that fall out of that change. And our experience of reality is ultimately a kind of merging beyond concepts, beyond intellection, an intuition of this experience of change. And actually, the idea that there are fixed concepts, fixed notions, anything that's fixed, even being, to him, being is nothing more than a static stopping change, a kind of reduction of change. Becoming is first, being is derivative. Whereas for Aristotle, it's the opposite, that being actuality, that is the highest of realities, and everything else is a kind of diminished form of actuality. Becoming is just a being that's there's a process of being that's not really complete. Well, for Bergson, you really just have to have an ineffable experience of the changing of reality, and you have to maybe get by in order to like negotiate your life. You have to split up concepts. You have to take little chops of becoming. But fundamentally, reality remains mysterious, right? Beyond your grasp, because, you know, it's intuited. It's not conceptually known. So Garrigou's entire presentation of like the mysteries of faith often is trying to get beyond that kind of Bergsonianism. In the great controversy of the Nouvelle Theologie, it's clear that some version of that Bergsonian view is operative in the young Jesuits he's writing against. They've got other things coming, but that's very much in the background there too. So that's a splatter shot that hopefully is going to give you a framework that maybe you can go back to the text and, you know, if you have other questions, you can always feel free. You can always stick a comment or question in my little form on my website too.
Now, there's another question here from Mr. Sir Dude. Could Dr. Minard comment on the transfiguration? What is being revealed to the apostles in light of the understanding of essence and energies? Do they experience it simply as a supernatural event, or is it a deeper knowledge of God being revealed to them?
Yeah, I mean, it's like I always get confused if I'm slurring together things in my mind, but it's, if I remember correctly, it's like a passing moment of the vision mediated through that event, even for the Thomists. I'd have to go back and look at the Transfiguration texts in Summa 4. That's definitely how I think of it, to be honest, is just like how for St. Paul and Moses, there was some spiritual experience that wrapped them out of their bodies, right? St. Thomas actually says that was an experience of the beatific vision, but they didn't have it habitually the way that the blessed have it, and that's how I always, you know, reinterpret the Transfiguration, to try to lend as much weight as I can in a Palamite direction, which I think is fundamentally actually spot on, because it's you know, it's attested to in so many patristic homilies. And let me see here, the clarity of the Transfiguration. Yeah, because was the brightness of the Transfiguration the brightness of glory? And even Thomas says, yes, it was. So, you know, that's not talked about enough. That's Summa Theologia Tertia Pars, question 45, article 2.
Now, in many ways, you're a Thomist, but you do hold to the essence and energies distinction?
No, don't do this to me. You're Orthodox listening.
Well, I'm
not trying to hide it. I really am not. Just, I mean, I must be, you know, here's what the thing is. I'm so appreciative of what's going on there. And I appreciate the fact that there's such an attempt to maintain essential supernaturality, and yet the fact that our participation in the divine nature is a participation, right? Like, that's what's going on. Palamas is trying to say at once this is uncreated, and yet, you know, it's not the divine it's not the divine essence and transcendence. I so appreciate that as long as we don't talk about a real distinction there, I slide the conversation away from that. No, I named my daughter after the person who probably on the distinction question is the most anti-distinction, Cajetan. Like everything else, though, like the uncreated character of grace, the non-comprehension that we have thereof, the way that our participation in grace is infinitely derivative in comparison with, the divine uncreated. Like all of that, I'm fine with. But the distinction between them, that's where ultimately I'm going to start like blowing up your inbox.
So the part where you said the church fathers attest to this, what that was to what specifically? I may have
I'm
misunderstood.
talking more in the Transfiguration that's something like the full clarity of glory in Thomas' terms, right? I mean, that's such an ancient theme that what happens there at the Transfiguration is, all of a sudden they experience through in however you want to say it. It's like an instrument. In that light, they're seeing spill over the Son of Man the glory that was in some ways hidden up to that point, because in that point of his incarnation, by the dispensation that he willed from all eternity with the Father, he had not yet let his full glory spill out over his resurrected self, right? But there for a minute, the full glory of the uncreated life that makes for the grace of union, as Thomas call it, that giving of the second person of the word of the human nature of Christ, spills forth into before the eyes of the apostles, because they're going to need it because they're turning toward Jerusalem. That's too ancient of a theme to write down. So they're
seeing uncreated light then.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm fine with that. I'm just not that it posits a real distinction within the divinity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
maybe I'm like, I have to go look at the text again. I always am like, maybe I'm reading it in a slightly Palamite way, I don't really care. I think that has to just be the case. I do think that the Palamites are right, because that's what the Palamites saw very clearly. Palamas himself, and then those following thereafter, and everyone till today sees that if that sort of communication is said to be impossible, you're going to basically not be able to divinize anything in nature, right? See that kind of implication, and they see that if you're going to lower that to something that's just a kind of created light, right? You have a real created light that's present. You have to be very careful not to have a kind of weird dualism, because it could turn into like, they were experiencing the light because they were experiencing the vision of the uncreated light, but then it also created the created light. No, in and through that light as a kind of instrument, the uncreated light was showing. Somewhat, Losky tries to do that in Vision of God, because he tries to show this idea of how the Palamite position there engages a kind of full anthropology of the human person, right? Both the physicality of it along with the spirituality, because he's trying to do this whole thing where he's saying Evagrianism is all about just the spirituality of that kind of experience, whereas in and through the physical experience of light, the uncreated shines forth. And so this bears witness to the unique synthesis in Palamas that gets beyond Evagrianism. I mean, I think he may be doing a tiny bit too much there, because he's trying to force it back on the texts. I just say clearly that has to be that's what Palamas is getting at, even if his language is very Neoplatonic. So,
not to get too tangential, but I mean, I guess from a Thomistic perspective, you're not going to see a distinction between God's essence and then, of course, his effects in the world. And so if they're seeing
I'll
the
see a real distinction there. But the distinction is, I mean, there's no distinction in the Godhead. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. There's a distinction between those two, but they're not seeing a created effect. They're seeing an uncreated light, as you noted. How would they be able to do that without the uncreated somehow becoming created, I guess?
You're talking about, so...
Well, they saw in the Transfiguration, they saw the uncreated light, and of course there's no distinction in the Thomistic view within God. So what if they're seeing the uncreated light, they're seeing the essence itself?
Well, it would be... I'm sorry, there are a couple different things going on here as well. So one is the newness is all on the side of the effect. Just as, when we convert, God is now newly present to the soul through grace when we convert or reconvert to him. And then also, too, the divine essence is, okay, this is where, the divine essence is fully present to the apostles there in the Thomas account. Just subjectively, they're going to be proportioned to it by something like the light of glory that they still don't fully comprehend, because their intellect cannot actually grasp the full communication that is given to them. So, once again, this gets mired too quickly into the distinction question. It's kind of like hovering in the background of all of this when you get into these Palamite discussions. God fully communicates all of his uncreatedness, is what they say. But he also communicates the subjective capacity to receive him. And so the subjective capacity to receive him, which in glory is the light of glory, here it's some kind of transient, it's just for this occasion, equivalent to the light of glory, makes them ready to receive through a communication, subjectively makes them in their intellects ready to receive God as he's communicating himself to them.
So would it be proper to say that they're seeing the essence, but in a mode fitting for a creature?
Yeah. A divinized creature, right? Because there's also a way to see the essence of God through a mode that's like connatural, but that's going to be so distant, and that's natural theology.
Is that through like effects and things like that?
Yeah, that would be like knowing that thing we said about that highest truth is that there is a supernatural order of truths. It's so negative. It just skims the surface of God, if we can use it. But to the degree that it can be received by this receiver, normally you would say, in view of the merits of the love that they lived in life charity. Here it's though in view of salvation history unfolding in the incarnation, right? To prepare them in some mysterious way, because they screw up, right? They all abandon Christ. But that experience is so central that Peter, brings it up later on in his epistles, right? That had some central role for his experience of grace thereafter. That's the light they're given subjectively to proportion them to the degree that they need to receive the self-communication of God. So everything is like, it's like God is fully giving himself, but also is giving the receptive capacity to receive him to the degree that is possible.
I think that would be fun to do a whole show on, just talking about the transfiguration.
It would be great if you could get someone like Father Macconi, the Jesuit, or Father Totleben.
He was on. I read his master's.
Yeah, very good masters. That's
really good. Yeah, he kind of takes that view that Thomism and Palimism are not compatible, but they don't rise to the level of dogma. So these are basically theological opinions that we can disagree on.
Yeah, they're theological conclusions. I mean, really the distinction on the side of the Godhead gets. I mean, it's like what you're trying to do is use a big Proclean Neoplatonic language. But in the end, it's a difference at the level of theology, and it's because of the Proclean metaphysics versus a very developed Aristotelian and then later scholastic distinction of distinctions. That's where it all happens. That's everything. That's where the rubber meets the road. And there are other discussions you can have with Palamites that don't often come up about like the distinction between the grace of union in Christ and our grace. Like you have to apply the essence energies to that as well, because it's an ancient patristic theme about the divinization of Christ's human nature, which the Thomists will talk about the habitual grace of the human nature of Christ. Because you really do need that in order to connect up Christ as our model to like our moral and divinized model to the theology of grace, and also to do your ecclesiology right. So there's all of that. There's something that often you'll see in the discussion with like even in like Norman Russell's discussion of this stuff. He's very honest that how is it that you can have the individual missions of persons when the energies seem to apply only to the essential activities of God, all three persons? Like the old Western adage that the actions of the Godhead externally are undivided, right? So there's just all this room for discussion that could be had. That it's two different theological syntheses going on here. But there's, the big fundamental concerns, like Thomists are like this on the question of grace. Like if the Palamites and Thomists could see that against the great swath of the other schools, they are closest on the question of divinization. That I think, you'd have so much good that can be done. Like the divinization is at the heart of Thomist moral theology.
Last one here. Do each of the persons of the Trinity have a unique energy, or is it a shared energy among all three persons that people participate in? Is there any distinction, virtual, formal?
Yeah, Cajetan talks about this, that it's all the persons are the essence. They are, in the end, the divine essence is, it's very tempting. So if you don't mind me using the Western language for this, because that's how Cajetan cites it here, because he's arguing with Scotus. It's very interesting if you're thinking about the persons as being purely relative, right? The idea of subsistent relations. It's easy to think like, okay, being sometimes is absolute, like a substance, and sometimes being is relative, like a relation. But then you start thinking, okay, now I'm applying, these two different ways of thinking about being to God. But actually, God is above those both. He combines within the unity of the divine nature both unity and respectivity, or being towardness. So it's not not even single energy. It's just the divine essence, because the divine essence is not merely just the substantial being of God. It's actually at one and the same time, formally and eminently in itself and toward others. The three persons toward each other. It's a great quote. It's difficult. It's really difficult stuff to chew, but it's in the chapter on the eminence of the deity. That's where I said this last time. That's where he also says Cajetan at one point, though, pushes on the keyboard just a little bit too hard too. He goes a little too hard, right? He says it's a beautiful passage, but like a great master, he hit the key on the piano just a little bit too hard there. But it wasn't bad. It's something else about divine foreknowledge.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Mata, I appreciate you coming on and doing this. I want to point everybody again to Emmaus Academic. I'm going to put a link to the description. The Sense of Mystery by Father Garrigou-Lagrange, of course, translated by our very own Dr. Matthew Minard. Thank you so much for talking to us about this book, Dr. Minard.
This is wonderful. It's a great text. This is a more exciting text. I mean, you can consider getting the Order of Things. It's a very good text, much more earnest. But this text has gone. I just doing the talk here tonight reminded me of how much this text influenced me. It's a great text. So forgive any slight clunkiness first translation. It's still not bad when I look at it, but be kind. It's a great text.
I think it'd be better than pretty much any of us. So. Well, I don't even think that any of us would be prepared to know what was clunky and what's not. So
it's lonely. It's lonely work. So be merciful. Anyway, enjoy it. It's a great book. It's so wonderful to just pitch something and be like, I get a little bit of clams for it, but this is Garrigou's work. I'm trying to promote his work. It is good. It's good stuff, and it shows that he's not just a cold old meanie. So,
yeah. And I'm glad that you're helping break that stereotype. It's very much needed. Well, again, thank you for coming on, Dr. Minard, and doing this. All of y'all, thank you for your participation there in the chat. Of course, Justin, thank you for your call earlier. We'll send you out the beer cup whenever you send us your mailing address. Everybody, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe, and share this on your social media. And, of course, check us out at patreon.com/Reason in Theology if you would like to support us. And y'all can also go to reasonintheology.com, click on the gear page, and you'll be able to see the beer mug and coffee mug, stuff like that if y'all are interested. Till next time, God bless.